We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their character will contain unalienable rights. That's among these are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. I am dear Governor Abbott. We did the scrutiny test. We have written to the Court of Appeal. We have written to you. We have spoken out about injustice in this case. I'm just asking you in this situation, how long, how many people has to be wrongfully accused, jailed, executed? Are these laws made for us? Life, liberty, and pursuit without due process of law? Who is it containing to? What about our rights? What about this man that's fighting for his life? Look how long this has been going on in the South. We have been fighting and fighting this. And I'm just going to repeat myself again. 2002, a skinhead told me their organization, they don't have to wear the hoodies anymore. They organization pay for their people to go to college. They become lawyers, judges, doctors, work in the White House, white collar, blue collar. They say they no longer have to wear the sheets anymore. So is this true, Governor Abbott? Do you want this man blood on your hands? I don't want another execution and then years later apologize to the family. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. I am going to continue to fight. I'm going to continue to write you. I'm going to continue to express my opinion, to use my voice, because we went through this before. Wrongfully accused, and we had to fight. 4 African American men in my family had to go through something like this, and we had to fight. Why do we have to fight harder than anybody else to prove our innocence? Why do we have to beg and plead? So, are these constitution, the laws, are they written for other than us? Tell me this. We hired you to uphold the law and to be fair. And you're not responding. You're not responding. And why? Do y'all care about us? Or y'all really don't care about us? How long we gonna have to go through this? I don't want us an apology after the we made a mistake. This is the time right now. This is the time right now. We the scrutiny test, we did what we had to do. And we're still doing it. Can you do it? I'm not gonna ask you, can you? I know you can do it. Why are you looking over this? This is an innocent man that's fighting for his life. How long we gonna have to go through this fight to prove our innocence? We fight harder than anybody else to prove our innocence, and people still turn a blind eye and look over. And so I'm gonna ask you again, Governor Abbott, Do you want this man blood on your hands? Hi everyone, this is your girl Texas Black Diamond. Welcome to my channel, and just want to let you guys know we have to keep fighting. Watch the video.
Prepared to take the constitutional oath of office.
Yes, I am.
And then with your left hand on your family Bible and on the Houston Bible, which governors have used for this oath of office since Sam Houston, and raising your right hand, repeat after me. I, Greg Abbott, do solemnly swear
I, Greg Abbott, do solemnly swear
that I will faithfully execute
that I will faithfully execute
the duties of the office
the duties of the office
of Governor of the State of Texas,
of Governor of the State of Texas,
and will to the best of my ability
and will, to the best of my ability,
preserve, protect, and defend
preserve, protect, and defend
the Constitution and laws
the Constitution and laws
of the United States and of this state,
of the United States and of this state.
so help me God.
So help me God.
Congratulations.
My name is John Bunn. I was recently exonerated after 27 years for being accused and convicted of a crime I had no knowledge of, I had nothing to do with. I was 14 years old.
I'm an innocent man, Your Honor, and I have always been an innocent man, Your Honor.
One morning I was having breakfast and we had got a bang on our door, and it was a gang of police. They rushed into my home and they started saying I was involved in a fight and a robbery, and they wanted to take me down to the police station for questioning.
August 13th, 1991, Crown Heights, Brooklyn. 2 off-duty correction officers were ambushed.
Police say the 2 gunmen forced the officers from their car, shot them, and then stole the car.
They took me down to 77 Precinct. The interrogation was actually led by a rogue detective by the name of Louis Garcella, and he was threatening me, telling me that I was never coming home if I wouldn't tell him what he wanted to know. He put me in a lineup with grown men. He made me sit down and hold a number up, and a couple minutes later he came back and told me it was my lucky day that I got picked. I woke up the next day thinking it was a dream, that it was like I was going to be home, that it wasn't real.
One of the most interesting, crazy, incredible cases of American jurisprudence deals with Scottsboro. Again, you can't understand unless you've got the context of the Great Depression. You have folks riding the rails looking for work, just because they can't afford to, I'll go find this job here. So they're just hopping on a train and riding in, trying to find work wherever they can find work. Well, what happens in the Scottsboro case is you have 9 black teenagers, and some of them get in a fight on the train with a couple of white guys. The train stops in Scottsboro, because this fight has broken out. As they're getting off the train, as the sheriff's folks are there, the white guys get off, the black guys get off, and then 2 white women get off. And the townsfolk are looking around going, oh. And the white women, because you've got black guys and white women in Alabama in the early 1930s, I believe 1932. It's like, whoa. And the women, Victoria Price and Ruby Bates, yell rape and say that these 9 black teenagers raped them. The town immediately took the 9 kids, hauled them in jail. There was a 1-day trial for these 9 kids that ranged from the age of like 12 or 13 to 17. Known as the Scottsboro Boys. In this trial, Victoria Price described a horrific rape. Well, the problem was that the doctor who had examined these women said, there's no evidence of rape here. But that didn't stop the jury. The doctor now didn't testify that there was no evidence of rape. But it was very clear that he knew there was no evidence of rape. And he had told folks there was no evidence of rape. These 9 black teenagers were convicted. And rape was an executable offense in the 1930s. And so in a 1-day trial, 8 of them were sentenced to die in the electric chair. The youngest was sentenced to life imprisonment in an Alabama prison. Now, there are multiple problems with that story. One, Ruby Bates, one of the women who had yelled rape, recanted, said it didn't happen. Now, let me tell you what really happened here. We're prostitutes. And the Mann Act, the Federal Mann Act, says that we were afraid of getting, because you can't cross state lines for immoral purposes. And since we crossed over out of Tennessee into Alabama, we were afraid that we might get brought up on federal charges. So we were just trying to protect ourselves. And so we just said, rape. Another part of the problem was that first the Communist Party's legal wing hopped in there and took this case up to the Supreme Court to try to protect the Scottsboro boys. Then the NAACP hopped in it. But a major Supreme Court decision was the Powell v. Alabama decision that came after this. Because think about this. You're on trial for your very life for a crime that never happened. Your court-appointed attorneys, one is the town drunk. I believe at the time he may have had a blood alcohol level of 0.2. I mean, lit. The other attorney in a capital case is probably in about the 4th stages of senility. So one of your attorneys is senile, looking for butterflies, and the other one is drunk, seeing butterflies. Now, the Supreme Court, even the Supreme Court in the 1930s went, really? No, come on. Come on. This is just too much even for us. And they remanded the case. They kicked the case back down. You got to try these fellas again. Well, what happens now that they've got a real legal team is that they began to construct the train and found out that many of the Scottsboro boys weren't even in the same car as the women. So how can a rape happen if the guys aren't in that car? They were convicted once again. Case goes back up to the Supreme Court. By the time there were so many egregious constitutional errors in this case that by the time the Scottsboro case is done, and eventually they start getting let out one by one by one by one, it took first 18 years for the last one. Imagine being in prison, in an Alabama prison. You are 17. You get out when you're 35 for a crime that never happened, a crime where one of the women has recanted, a crime where the evidence demonstrates that you couldn't have done this thing. This would be called an egregious wrong. You also had several who had escaped. Imagine trying to escape from an Alabama chain gang, but they managed to get out. Michigan refused. Alabama tracked one down up into Michigan. Michigan refused, and think about this, a state refusing to extradite a convicted felon back to Alabama because Michigan looked up and said, this is wrong. This is just wrong. The last one was pardoned by Governor George Wallace, sometime, I believe, in the 1980s. So imagine again, basically living in the shadows for almost 40, 50 years because of something that never happened, the charge of rape. I mean, Scottsboro speaks to so much in the criminal justice system. But what you also get in this is a series of Supreme Court decisions dealing with the right to competent counsel. Thank God. And the right to have a jury that is really truly a jury of your peers. Now, that is some amazing jurisprudence that is coming out of this case of horrific, egregious, unjust, justifiable. I have no more words for what happened at Scottsboro, but an egregious wrong that, in my eyes, has never been righted.
Dr. Sarah Wecht is a renowned forensic pathologist who has investigated many famous cases, including President John F. Kennedy, Elvis Presley, JonBenet Ramsey. He's joining us on satellite now to tell us what he discovered after looking at Stacy's autopsy report. In your opinion, do you believe that Stacy was murdered before midnight?
Yes, Dr. Phil. This is not a case in which there is a conjecture, subjective reasoning, or valid differences of opinion. As my distinguished colleagues, Dr. Michael Bodden, Dr. Werner Spitz, and Dr. Leroy Riddick before me have stated in the opinions that they set forth, I have concluded, after reviewing all of the information, the autopsy report, the photographs, and all of the background information, there is simply no question from a forensic scientific standpoint that Stacy Stites was murdered before midnight, that there is no way that the timing that is necessary for the prosecution to have brought this case and to have convicted Rodneyreed has any kind of validity. None. Livor mortis, which is present on the body when found on frontal portions of the face, shoulder, arm, and side, with the body lying face up. Livor mortis is the pattern of gravitational settling of blood in the dependent parts of the body. That shows you that she had been lying down for the livor mortis pattern to have developed. You don't get a livor mortis pattern in the front of the body when you are found lying face up. Rigor mortis, body stiffening, begins after a few hours, 8 to 12 hours, it gets fixed, and then it remains for about 36 to 48 hours before it breaks down. We see that when they are handling the body of Stacy Stites, there is already a marked degree of lessening of the pattern of rigor mortis. So that shows you that that does not fit in at all with the time period that the prosecution said. With regard to the spermatozoa, which you've talked about, millions of sperms are found in a CC. In this case, just a few sperm heads were found, and the testimony at the time given at the original trial was incorrect about the spermatozoa not remaining viable beyond 24 hours. Spermatozoa can remain viable for 72 hours. Then the external appearance of the body shows some greenish discoloration, shows some early skin slippage, shows some areas of light bloating even of the abdomen. These are already indicia of postmortem decomposition, which, coupled with the finding of purge-like fluid in the car, indicate clearly that Stacy Stites had been dead for several hours. This was not edematous fluid, the kind of clear fluid that builds up in the lungs when someone has congestive heart failure or so on. This was purge fluid, decomposition fluid. You put that all together, there is no question at all, based upon these hard forensic scientific data that have been around for centuries. Look at any forensic pathology textbook. Livor mortis, rigor mortis, postmortem decomposition, development of purge fluid, spermatozoa viability, put that all together, there is no question, I would say without hesitation, that this is one of the clearest, unequivocal cases of gross misjudgment, of travesty of justice that I've ever seen. You can argue about a lot of cases, and Dr. Phil, you and I have talked about some of these. In this case, there simply is no argument.
Well, let me tell you one thing additionally. This medical expert at the time, Dr. Roberto Bayardo, on August 13th of 2012, said time of death, if the prosecuting attorneys had advised me they intended to use my time of death estimate as a scientifically reliable opinion, I would have advised them not to do so. He went on to say, survival of sperm, the spermatozoa I found in Miss Stites could have been deposited days before her death. And with regard to sexual assault, there is no indication that the spermatozoa was placed there in any fashion other than consensually. So he completely changes what was relied upon at the time of trial. So it just seems to me, Doctor, that if he works for the state,
the state is prosecuting, if their own witness says, you misinterpreted what I said, you misused what I said, I now tell you that that is wrong, it seems to me they have to own that problem and step back from that conviction.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you, Doctor.
Absolutely. This is prosecutorial.
Thank you. Thank you.
In any event, at this point in time, the prosecution must take responsibility for not having presented the proper evidence, for having allowed improper evidence to be introduced, and how any judicial branch, in this case, the top-level court in the state of Texas, can not review and accept all of this testimony and stop this planned execution is beyond me. There's no way in the world that this can proceed.
Taken an unusual step and apologized for what happened to 4 young African-American men in Groveland, Florida, nearly 70 years ago in 1949. The men, known as the Groveland Four, were falsely accused of raping a 17-year-old white girl. Before going to trial, one of the 4 men, Ernest Thomas, was hunted down and murdered by a mob of 1,000 men led by the local sheriff, Willis McCall. He was killed in a hail of gunfire. The other 3 men were tortured in jail until 2 of them gave false confessions. Charles Greenlee was sentenced to life. Walter Irvin and Samuel Shepard were condemned to death. When Irvin and Shepard appealed their conviction, they were represented by Thurgood Marshall of the NAACP, who would later become the first African-American Supreme Court justice. Samuel Shepard later died after being shot by a sheriff and his deputy. Walter Irvin was also shot but survived. He eventually died in 1968, 2 years after being paroled. Charles Greenlee lived until 2012. But the story of the Groveland Four has continued to haunt the state of Florida. Last month, Charles Greenlee's daughter, Carol, thanked Florida lawmakers for apologizing to her family.
This is a glorious day. And still today, the tears are hard to hold back. But today, the tears are tears of joy. And I want to thank all of you for releasing my family from prison, from releasing my nieces, my son, my brothers, from the dark cloud, the shame and the stigma that have been put upon them, and releasing me for 67 years. I was the child. I was the baby that my father went to Groveland to find a job to support back in 1949. And today, I feel free.
Found guilty, and then ultimately the state of Alabama could go through and pardon them one by one. It took 80 years, but the last Scottsboro boy was pardoned, I think, a couple years ago. In this case, it's a little more complicated because the sheriff killed 2 of the men. So, in fact, Samuel Shepard, he was actually when the first trial was thrown out, the Supreme Court overruled it, said it was one of the great menaces to American justice. So technically, Sam Shepard was never convicted. So he can't get a pardon. So the apology does mean something to the Shepards, and it does mean something to the family of Ernest Thomas, who never stood trial. So he doesn't have a conviction, and he can't be pardoned. For the Irvins and for the Greenlees, they do have convictions. And so for half of the Groveland boys, the pardon means everything. So the apology, while great, and everybody acknowledges that it's an important step on the state of Florida, the journey is not quite done, because that pardon is going to go before the governor and the pardon board, and he's going to be asked to consider that.
Well, I want to turn to Walter Lee Irvin's sister, Henrietta Irvin. Here she explains Walter's account of what happened the night he and Sam Shepard were shot by Sheriff Willis McCall and a deputy.
When he opened the door for Sam, as Sam turned to get out of the car, Walter Lee said he shot him right in his forehead. just like that. He said he shot him so fast and he felt his weight moving until he knew that Sam was dead. He said, but by that time, he had done shot him also. And he said he remembered hearing him say, "Come on back, I have killed the son of a bitches." He said, but when Mr. Yates got back and he was shining his light on him, he kicked Sam and he shined the light on him and said, but this is not dead.
So that's Walter Lee Irvin's sister, Henrietta Irvin. So Gilbert King, your response to what she said.
Well, I think that this is a seminal moment in this entire story. Basically, this is the equivalent of cell phone camera footage of a killing. So Sam Shepard and Walter Irvin are handcuffed together. McCall comes around the car and shoots Sam Shepard 3 times. He dies instantly. Walter Irvin is shot twice. He can't run because he's handcuffed to his best friend, so he lays on the ground and pretends to be dead. But he's still living, and he hears the sheriff say, "Get back, I got the son of a bitches. We got to make it look like an escape." And he starts tearing at his clothes, rumpling his hat. The deputy sheriff comes back to the scene, shines a flashlight down on Walter Irvin and says, "This one ain't dead yet," pulls a gun and fires a 3rd shot straight through his neck. Miraculously, Irvin is still alive. And so when the FBI hears this story, which differs from Sheriff McCall's version, they have an idea where that bullet might be. So they go back to the crime scene, they find the blood stain where Walter Irvin was laying, take out a little shovel, and 10 inches below that blood stain, they find a .38 caliber bullet, which matches the gun of Sheriff Willis McCall. So here you have pure proof that the sheriff and the deputy have attempted murder and murder on their hands. This is all investigated by the FBI. The FBI is convinced that this happened, and yet it was quashed. And so that, I think, is one of the great tragedies. Thurgood Marshall never found out about this information. It just sat in an FBI file for 60 years. Stories like this lingered from the point of view of the sheriff. So if you look at what the version that stuck in Florida was that these were the rapists, they were convicted in court, and then they attacked the sheriff and tried to escape that night. And so that was the version that lingered. And so the families have lived under this stigma that you heard Carol Greenlee talk about, that they were associated with a rapist. And so it means the world to them to just have some official apology to clear their names. And I think it's just a part of, we have not really, as a country, really addressed these kind of issues. For the longest time, if you go into a community in the South especially, stories like this are very common, but they didn't become Supreme Court cases. They didn't have Thurgood Marshall. There was no appeals, and these men were just sent to their deaths. And so when families today react to police brutality, or really it's a legacy of decades of this kind of injustice that really angers people, because they know that these stories were not heard and that they were never acknowledged.
Finally, Gilbert King, if you could talk about this case in the context of criminal justice and what is happening with African Americans today. I mean, now in the news in Baton Rouge, the U.S. Justice Department says it's closed its investigation into the killing of Alton Sterling by police officers, one police officer shooting him in the stomach on top of him at point-blank range. Not clear what will happen next. The state expected to investigate this, the state of Louisiana, but Jeff Sessions' Justice Department will not bring charges. How does this fit into this picture?
Well, you know, this is a difficult question, because I think there's a lot of people out there that look at, you know, Jeff Sessions' appointment and think that perhaps that civil rights and this kind of investigation and this kind of progress that has been made might be taking a step backwards. And if there's all these safeguards put in for prosecutors to sort of feel that they have a little bit more of a sympathetic Justice Department, I think it's not a very good thing. I honestly believe that the families of not only the Groveland boys, but families who have been through this are deeply suspicious of prosecutors and police departments who enable this kind of thing to be quashed. Nowadays, it's a little more obvious because you do see cell phone footage of some of these things, and it defies what you're looking at. But back in the day, in the 40s and 50s, you really had the word of a policeman and a black corpse. And it was a very simple thing to just go before a coroner's jury or go before a grand jury because these communities were not willing to indict.
A Texas man is one step closer to freedom this morning after recent DNA testing cleared him of a rape in 1990. Michael Phillips has spent 12 years in prison after entering a plea deal that his attorney advised him to take. On Friday, a Dallas judge ruled his conviction should be vacated after the city's district attorney found evidence linking the crime to another man. Phillips says faith has guided him through the ordeal.
My Father God that got me through this. That's all I got to say. That speaks for itself. Pick up his book. It's truthful. See you through anything.
The Texas Court of Appeals must now rule on the decision. This is thought to be the first case in the U.S. where an innocent defendant was identified as a result of systematic screening and DNA testing, and not by a defendant or his attorneys.
In 1944, George Stinney Jr. was just 14 when a rush to judgment sent him to his death in South Carolina's electric chair. Convicted in the murders of two little white girls, Stinney's trial reportedly took just 3 hours. The all-white jury deliberated just 10 minutes. Now, 7 decades later, attorneys for the Stinney family asked for a new trial to clear his name.
George Stinney could not have committed these murders. I think George Stinney saw those children, but I don't think George Stinney was the last person to see those children.
The bodies of 11-year-old Betty June Binnicker and 7-year-old Mary Emma Thames were found in a ditch in the small town of Alcaloo. A coroner's report at the time described a brutal beating. Multiple severe head injuries suggested the killer used a blunt instrument about the size of a hammer. Family of the victim still believes Stinney was guilty.
They had no choice in how they died, and he did. And I think that justice was served according to the laws in 1944 when this happened.
In the few records that still exist, Stinney allegedly confessed, even told police where to find the murder weapon. During the trial, his attorney called no witnesses, asked no questions, and filed no appeal after the young boy was sentenced to death.
How did I know?
Today, Stinney's siblings testify the teen was innocent, with them the entire time.
And I want to clear the air. We are not allowed to go any place without my mother's permission. They were very strict with us. We could not go no place, nowhere.
And listening to the family on the stand today, they draw a picture of a case in which critical evidence seemed to be completely overlooked in this rush to judgment. They pointed out in a crime like this, there would have been a great deal of blood, and yet they found no blood anywhere on their brother's clothing. Don?
The obvious question, David, why did it take 70 years for this case to go back to court?
This was a very slow-moving thing, but it continued to build over the decades. At first, the family was afraid to speak out. They actually had to leave their home. The siblings were talking on the stand today about how they had to leave in fear that a mob might show up to do them all harm after their brother was arrested. So they left in fear and didn't talk about it for a while. But they continued to keep the conversation going, and it took decades for them to find people to listen, to be curious, and to actually start doing research on this. They actually came up with some potential witnesses to bolster their case, including one man who was the cellmate of their brother, who said the young man at the time said that he did not do this and that he was forced into a confession.
Glenn Ford here spent nearly 30 years on death row for a crime he didn't commit. According to the Innocence Project in New Orleans, Ford spent 29 years, 3 months and 5 days of his life in solitary confinement on death row. An innocent man, years behind bars, spending every waking moment wondering if this would be the week he dies. Well, last year, Ford was exonerated. He had been the longest-serving death row inmate in the U.S. at the time of his release. And just yesterday, Glenn Ford died. He only tasted freedom for a few months after losing his entire adult life. The prosecutor who helped put Ford behind bars would come to regret his role in Ford's wrongful conviction. He has since apologized to Ford, both in an open letter and then during an emotional meeting in person. ABC News captured that encounter.
Mr. Ford.
Marty, how you doing?
How are you?
Doing all right. You know, I've thought about this for a long, long time. I want you to know that I am very sorry, and I wish it's a stain on me that will be with me until I go to my grave. And I wasn't a very good person at all. So I apologize for that.
Right, but then it still cost me 31 years of my life and debt, nothing at the end but death, because it gave me from 6 to 8 months to live.
There's nothing to say sufficient to give you those 30 years back.
It happened, and I'm sorry I can't forgive you. I really am,
I understand.
Okay.
I do, and I wish you well, and I wish you nothing but the best.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. And may God bless you.
You too.
You take care of yourself, okay?
All right, you too.
Glenn Ford was 65 years young when he died of lung cancer. The prosecutor, the man who wrongfully convicted him, is now calling for the abolishment of the death penalty. I want to talk more about Glenn Ford's story with his attorney, William Most. William, welcome.
Thank you.
I mean, I woke up, I read this first thing this morning, and I felt such grief for him and his family and was horrified just by this entire story. But I have to wonder, in the few months he had tasting freedom as an adult, what did he do? What did he see?
Glenn was an inspirational person, and even after so many injustices had been heaped upon him, he focused on the future. And with the 15 months of freedom he had, he was able to go to California and see his children and his many grandchildren, which brought him a lot of joy. And he was able to spend time with friends and loved ones in New Orleans and go out and enjoy the festivals and music and everything New Orleans has to offer. So there was a lot of sadness, but a lot of joy as well.